What if the greatest strategic blunder in modern American history wasn't a war or a failed treaty, but a series of angry tweets? What if a president, in a fit of pique, accidentally handed his country's closest ally the keys to its own economic prison? Because while Donald Trump was busy drawing lines on a map and threatening to make Canada the 51st state, he missed the fleet of oil tankers quietly leaving a port in British Columbia, charting a course that would permanently redraw the economic map of North America. He thought he was building a wall, but all he did was force Canada to build a bridge, and that bridge leads directly to Asia. Let's be perfectly clear about what used to be. For the better part of a century, the Canada-US relationship wasn't so much a partnership as it was a dependency. It was a company town, and Washington, roughly 70 cents of every dollar Canada earned from exports came from the United States. Think about that. Our manufacturers in Ontario, our energy producers in Alberta, our farmers on the prairies, they all built their businesses, their lives, and their futures on a single, sacred assumption: that the American market, our massive, thirsty neighbor to the south, would always be open for business. It was the bedrock of Canadian economic policy. And in 2025, Donald Trump took a sledgehammer to it. Did he think we would just roll over? The internal projections certainly suggested we should have. When the 35% tariffs hit, the forecasts were bleak. Oxford Economics, not exactly a radical organization, started using phrases like long-term scarring. They predicted the Canadian economy wouldn't just be smooth. This wasn't some scare tactic from the opposition party. It was the baseline forecast from one of the world's most respected economic firms. The theory in Washington was simple, and frankly, insulting. Squeeze Canada hard enough, inflict enough economic pain, and the nice, polite people up north would eventually come crawling back to the table, ready to accept whatever terms were dictated. But they miscalculated. They mistook Canadian politeness for weakness. They forgot that when you back a country into a corner, it doesn't just lie down, it looks for another door. And what a door it found. It's a story of steel and political will that most Americans have never heard, because their own administration tried desperately to kill it. The Trans Mountain Expansion Project. For years, it was a political football, bogged down by protests and regulatory hurdles. The Obama administration was lukewarm at best. The Trump administration, in its infinite wisdom, actively tried to obstruct it. But the Canadian government, seeing the writing on the wall long before the tariffs were even announced, pushed it through. Completed in May 2024, it was more than just a pipeline. It was an escape hatch. It tripled Canada's oil export capacity from a modest 300,000 barrels per day to a game-changing 890,000. And here's the punchline. Almost every single new barrel of that oil is flowing west to Asia, not south to the United States. Let's look at the numbers, because they don't just tell a story, they deliver a verdict. Before the expansion, in early 2024, according to Canada's own State of Trade report, our oil shipments to countries that are not the United States were averaging $660 million every single month. That's nearly $8 billion in new annual revenue that simply did not exist less than 2 years ago. Revenue that now bypasses the United States entirely. And when you look at where that oil is going, the sheer scale of this strategic pivot becomes breathtaking. In the last 7 months of 2024, a staggering 59% of all Alberta crude shipped by sea went straight to China. Another 15% went to Singapore, 12% to Hong Kong, and the United States, our supposedly indispensable partner. They were forced to sell their product at a discount, the so-called Canadian differential, because they had no other buyers. There was nowhere else to go. That structural disadvantage evaporated the moment the first tanker set sail from the Westridge Marine Terminal. Now, when Donald Trump gets on Twitter and threatens annexation or more tariffs, Prime Minister Mark Carney and his officials don't have to tremble. They can simply point across the Pacific and say, with all the politeness a Canadian can muster, "Thank you for your interest, but we have other customers now. Customers who pay on time and don't threaten to nationalize our country. Leverage isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who has the best options. And for the first time in history, Canada has options. But this revolution isn't just about oil. It would be a mistake to think this is merely an energy fundamental. According to a deep dive analysis by the Globe and Mail, Canadian businesses across dozens of sectors are rotating their export markets at a speed that has left economists scrambling to update their models. The report is stunning in its detail. Of the $18.5 billion in exports lost to Trump's tariffs, Canadian firms have already clawed back nearly $11 billion. Not through government subsidies or hopeful projections, but by finding new buyers in 27 different countries. This is real revenue, replacing lost American sales in real time. We're talking about everything from Ontario Auto Parts finding new markets in Europe, to British Columbia lumber heading to Japan, to Saskatchewan lentils and pulses feeding a growing middle class in India. The learning curve for accessing Asian and European markets, once thought to be steep and costly, has turned out to be surprisingly short. Because when your biggest customer suddenly becomes your biggest bully, you learn very, very quickly. And how was this possible? Because the groundwork was laid years ago, with infrastructure investments made under the assumption that one day we might need them. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, which cost 4.7 billion Canadian dollars, is the star of the show. But it's not the only piece of the puzzle. The Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby, the pipeline's endpoint, can now load 630,000 barrels of oil onto tankers every day. And here's the part that should keep American strategists up at night. As of April 2025, it hasn't even hit its full stride. Throughput has. That means there is still a massive amount of room for growth. Canadian officials are already working with the Port of Vancouver to solve operational bottlenecks, specifically to clear the way for even more Asia-bound traffic. This isn't a temporary reaction to a trade spat. This is a permanent re-engineering of Canada's economic geography. So when does a trade story become a national security crisis for the United States? The answer is, right now. For more than 70 years, American foreign and economic policy was built on a simple, unspoken assumption: the geographic captivity of its neighbors. Canada and Mexico were, for all intents and purposes, captive markets and captive suppliers. The infrastructure, the supply chains, the business relationships, everything pointed north-south. This reality gave Washington enormous, almost unchecked leverage. If a president wanted concessions on anything, labor standards, environmental rules, security policy, they could threaten to close the border, knowing full well that Canadian businesses had no realistic alternative. That leverage is not just shrinking, it's evaporating before our eyes. The leaked economic assessments cited by numerous Canadian economists were clear. Trump's tariff campaign was designed to force Canada to capitulate. The pain was supposed to bring us to our knees, but they forgot to account for Canadian resilience. And they certainly didn't account for a leader like Mark Carney. Instead of buckling, Canada spent 2025 executing one of the most audacious diplomatic and economic pivots in modern history. While Trump was holding rallies, Prime Minister Carney was on a plane. He personally crisscrossed the globe, traveling to the Middle East, to Europe, and throughout Asia, signing preliminary trade frameworks and locking down new investment agreements. The government launched a formal trade diversification strategy, a comprehensive multi-billion-dollar effort to hardwire the Canadian economy into the fastest-growing markets in the world, markets that are not in the United States. And this is the part that is truly irreversible. These are not handshake deals. This is permanent infrastructure. When a Canadian energy company signs a 10-year contract to supply a refinery in Shanghai, that relationship doesn't vanish if Trump loses an election. When a Canadian parts manufacturer retools its factory to meet European specifications and builds a supply chain through the port of Halifax, it doesn't just switch back, because a new administration in Washington says please. The shipping routes, the logistical networks, the personal relationships, they are being optimized for Pacific and Atlantic trade, not just cross-border trade. The muscle memory of the Canadian economy is changing. And the irony is, it's working. Despite Trump's economic war, Canada is not just surviving. In many ways, it's thriving. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, just released its latest projections. For 2026, Canada is forecast to have the second fastest GDP growth in the entire G7. Who's number one? The United States. But our growth is happening in spite of their tariffs, not because they were lifted. It's growth fueled by new markets and new customers. Canadian officials are now saying the quiet part out loud, something that would have been diplomatic heresy just a few years ago. The United States is no longer a reliable partner. You can't unsay those words. You can't unlearn that lesson. It represents a fundamental reassessment of the most important relationship in Canadian history, a relationship that has defined this continent since the end of the Second World War. What we are witnessing is the collapse of America's single greatest structural advantage in its own hemisphere. Geographic captivity is over. And it's not just us. Trade data shows that Mexico, also a target of Trump's tariff policies, has been rapidly accelerating its own diversification efforts, strengthening ties with the European Union. America's closest friends and neighbors are systematically de-risking their economies. They are building a world where they are no longer dependent on the political whims of Washington, D.C. Trump's America First policy has resulted in an America-alone reality on its own continent. He thought he was punishing his neighbors, but he was actually liberating them from their dependence on him. Think again about that 60% recovery rate. Canadian businesses have already replaced 11 billion of the 18.5 billion they lost from the American market, and they did it in less than 18 months. And that rate is accelerating. The Globe and Mail report noted that our firms are learning to navigate new markets faster than any economic model had predicted. If this trend continues, Canada could fully replace all lost U.S. export revenue by the end of 2026. His tariffs will stop being a weapon and start being a nuisance, an irrelevant relic of a failed policy. When the two sides sit down for the mandatory CUSMA trade agreement review in July 2026, the entire power dynamic will have been upended. Canada will no longer be negotiating from a position of desperation. But the damage goes even deeper than trade statistics. For decades, the United States has invested billions in a concept it called continental energy security. The idea was to integrate the energy markets of Canada, the US, and Mexico so tightly that North America would become an energy fortress, invulnerable to shocks from hostile suppliers in the Middle East or Russia. It was a strategy built on a foundation of pipelines flowing south, cross-border electricity grids, and a shared regulatory environment. But the entire edifice rested on one critical, unspoken assumption, that Canadian energy had nowhere else to go. The Trans Mountain Pipeline didn't just break that assumption, it shattered it. Canadian energy can now flow west just as easily as it flows south. The concept of a captive Canadian resource pool serving American interests is now obsolete. Canada is no longer a tenant in America's energy fortress. It is a landlord with properties all over the world. So where does this all lead? The immediate flashpoint is July 2026, the CUSMA review. And Prime Minister Carney has already signaled that this will not be business as usual. He has publicly stated that Canada is unlikely to cut any side deals on specific sectors like steel, aluminum, or lumber before the main negotiations begin. He's putting everything on the table at once. This is a massive shift in strategy. In the past, we would have tried to negotiate relief sector by sector, trying to put out the biggest fires first. Now, Canada is preparing to use the entire agreement as leverage, with the credible threat of walking away if the tariffs aren't removed. And it is a credible threat, because the data proves we can survive it. We've already taken the hit. Despite losing $18.5 billion in export revenue, Canada's economy is growing faster than almost any of its peers. Our unemployment rate, while higher than we'd like, hasn't collapsed. In fact, our manufacturing sector has fared better than America's. Since the tariffs began in earnest in March 2025, Canada has lost about 30,000 manufacturing jobs. That's painful. But over the same period, the United States, the country that started the trade war, has lost 60,000 manufacturing jobs, largely due to the higher input costs and supply chain chaos caused by its own policies. So Canada walks into the most important negotiation in a generation with a kind of leverage it has never ever had before, the proven ability to live without America. And this is the final crucial point that everyone needs to understand. This isn't a pendulum that can swing back. Trade diversification is a one-way street. Once those long-term contracts are signed with Chinese and Singaporean firms, they don't get torn up. Once the logistics are perfected for Pacific shipping, they don't get abandoned. Once Canadian businesses have built relationships of trust with new partners in Asia and Europe, they won't discard them just because a future American president promises to be nicer. Canadian exporters now have options. They have customers who will pay fair market prices without the constant threat of political blackmail. The era of Canadian economic dependence is over. It died in 2025. And the strangest, most ironic part of it all is that we didn't end it. Donald Trump did. In his quest to make America great again, he inadvertently made Canada independent. And for that, maybe we should send him a thank you card. What do you think? Is this the biggest strategic own goal in modern American politics? Share your opinion in the comments. If you find this video interesting, please hit like, share.
Carney is arguing that Canadian energy is the antidote. It is produced under the stable rule of law. It is backed by predictable regulations and a democratic government. It is not subject to the whims of a dictator or the overnight military adventures of a volatile president. He continues, linking this inherent stability to Canada's strategic goals. We also see the competitiveness of Canadian oil. And we're investing, or we're putting in place measures so that that's going to happen. And in that context, a pipeline and exports to Asia. We've got competitive product, and we'd be diversifying our markets, and that's one of the reasons why we signed the comprehensive with Alberta. So we'll be working towards that. He acknowledged that a stable Venezuela's oil sector should and will prosper. That stability and economic growth are in everyone's interest. But he was equally, unshakably clear about something else. Canadian oil is already in demand, not as a replacement for chaos, but as an alternative to it. It is trusted, it is stable. It is produced under a system of laws and ethics that the world can count on. Carney's point was subtle, but incredibly powerful. Donald Trump's attempts to reshape global energy politics through military force and intimidation do not diminish Canada's position in the world. They strengthen it. They highlight our value. As instability and unpredictability rise everywhere else, Canada's stability, Canada's resources, and Canada's principles become more valuable, not less. This wasn't bravado. This wasn't wishful thinking. It was a statement of confidence rooted in reality. In that moment, Mark Carney wasn't just defending Canadian resources. He was defending Canada's entire brand, our relevance, our reliability, and our growing leverage in a world that seems to be becoming more volatile by the day. And the message, to Washington and to the world, was clear. Canada will not be pushed aside. Canada will not be undercut by strongman tactics. And Canada will not allow its future to be overshadowed by chaos manufactured elsewhere. So let's bring it all back. Mark Carney's emergency meetings in Europe weren't about theatrics or photo opportunities. They were about something far more serious. They were about prevention. Canada, standing with its allies, understands something absolutely fundamental about this moment in history. If the world responds to Donald Trump's provocations country by country, picking us off one by one. Then each one of us is vulnerable. But if democracies respond together, if we reaffirm our shared values and our collective security, then the boundaries will hold. The rule of law will prevail. Greenland is the test case. Europe is the meeting ground. And Canada, thankfully, is no longer waiting on the sidelines to see what happens next. We are at the table, leading the conversation because we know, perhaps better than most, that once annexation threats and bullying tactics become normal, no country is too close, too friendly, or too secure to become the next target. Share your opinion in the comments. If you find this video interesting, please hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything.
If you find this video interesting, please hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything.
It is a massive, multi-billion-dollar gamble. But if it pays off, it changes everything. If Canada can build a first-rate Arctic surveillance system without the US, who else might want to buy it? Suddenly, Canada isn't just a customer. They are a competitor. And that is a role the US, especially under this administration, is absolutely not ready to see them in. Share your opinion in the comments. If you find this video interesting, please hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything.